Chapter 4 is types of speeches, but the beginning of chapter 4, we start with strategies for speaking. So we talked about this a little bit in chapter 1 when we talked about Aristotle and how he gave us a lot of things in public speaking or in rhetoric. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about his proofs here. So remember that Aristotle created two types of proofs. He created inartistic and artistic. So inartistic are proofs that cannot be created by the speaker. Okay, they're there, like the gun in a murder case. You can't create the gun. It's just it is there or it's not there, right? But artistic proofs, Aristotle said, if you want people to be persuaded by what you have to say, you have to create these three artistic proofs: ethos, pathos, logos. Okay, so ethos is our ethics, our credibility. We create that multiple times. So we have initial credibility, and that's the credibility that you build with your audience before you've ever spoken a word. Okay? So that's the credibility that you build when you get up from your seat, when you walk up here, your posture, your dress, the way you appear, all of that's initial credibility. And a lot of my students will say, well, that's not fair, right? That's just judging someone before you actually know them. And that's exactly what that's doing. And we're doing it all the time, okay? There's no way as a human being for our minds to not do that, okay? We are conditioned to do that from a very young age to make those initial judgments. So that's going to be your initial credibility. Your derived credibility is created throughout the speech. So as I get up here and I give you a speech, if it's organized, if it makes sense, if I have good sources, if I'm able to deliver it well, then that's my derived credibility. So it's either building my credibility or it's breaking it down. Then we're left with our terminal credibility. So our terminal credibility is our initial credibility plus our derived credibility. And that's what we end with. When I go sit down, if I'm speaking to y'all, how you feel about me at that moment is then the derived, the terminal credibility, how I have come across as a whole, okay? So if you think about the fact that you could begin with negative initial credibility, right? If I got up here and everything about me, you're like, ooh, I don't know, right? And then maybe I gain some back through the speech, but then I could still sit down with negative terminal credibility, okay? So credibility is always being built and always kind of being destroyed. It's a lot like, well, it is trust, right? So if you lied to your parents a lot in high school, you made a lot of mistakes, like that credibility, it can continue to go down, or maybe you did it once, but then you figured it out, and then so you were better, and then so your credibility was raised. Okay. The thing to remember is you never start even. From the moment that we see you, you're either building or tearing down credibility. Okay, in public speaking. So you want to be very aware of that as you are going through your speeches, and how can you show your audience that you're someone that can be trusted and someone that is telling the truth. Logos means logic or logical. So as a speaker, you have to have a logical argument. You can't get up here and kind of be all over the place and not really make sense and not really have good logical arguments and then assume that we're all going to believe you. Sometimes that happens, right? Like if you look at our politicians and the way that they say all this stuff, I mean, they're constantly hurting and harming their credibility, right? Nonstop. Like it's always kind of this ebb and flow where they're like, oh, that didn't look good, so now I got to do this, right? If we just even looked at the last couple of weeks, right? So Ted Cruz has gone to Cancun. Oh, people blast him. Oh, and then he shows a lot of pictures like, no, look, I'm helping, blah, blah, blah. That's just credibility going up and down. And it changes based on what your viewpoint is, on what you think Ted Cruz should be doing, what you believe he could have been doing in Texas during the storm. Like, it's kind of a personal philosophy, right? Your worldview looking at the credibility. So for some, that credibility might be really high, and for some it may be really low, but it's going to be based on your worldview. But he's doing things then to try to ebb his credibility up, right? Same thing with logic. You have to have a logical argument. Now, a lot of logic is based on worldview, right? So what I think is really logical may not be logical to you at all, right? And it's interesting to kind of look, if you look at specifically politics, where people get so upset and so annoyed and so angry about what specific politicians' policies are or what they're saying, Because it's all about worldview, right? Because what I think is logical, the next person may be like, that doesn't make sense at all. Why do you think that? That makes you a bad person or whatever. It's all based in worldview, right? So logic, you have to have a logical argument. You have to create and lay out a logical foundation for your audience, but also know that based on their worldview, they may get on board with that logic or they may not. And then the final artistic proof is pathos. So pathos means emotion. And I kind of look at pathos in two kind of separate ways. One, pathos that I create, the emotion that I have for the topic, right? So my emotion for the topic is really important because if I don't seem emotional about it, if I don't have any connection to it, you're not going to have any connection to it. And that's why in my classroom, I tell you, yes, I want you to pick topics that are interesting, that are new, that are current, that even might be a little controversial. I want you to pick topics mostly that you care about, though. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you pick a topic that you're like, I don't know that anybody cares about this. In this classroom, I'd really rather you pick a topic that you are very emotionally connected to because then it's going to emotionally connect us to it, okay? If you get up here and you just picked a topic that you found online and you have no emotional connection to that topic, then you're going to be bored and then we'll be bored, right? So it's important that you're emotionally connected, but then also as a speaker, I have to figure out ways to get you emotionally connected to the topic as well. Okay, so if I pick something that I care a lot about, you're going to see that emotion, but that doesn't mean that necessarily you're going to have that same emotion that I do. So my job as a speaker is to figure out what can I say that's going to get my students or my audience on board with me and have the same emotional connection that I have. And you can do that in a lot of different ways, a lot of different speaking, what's the word I'm looking for? Rhetorical devices, I guess, that can allow you to connect with your audience and allow them to like really feel what you're feeling, right? And some of that is very shifty, okay? So some of that, we look at that and we're like, well, that kind of ruins their credibility because they use these, you know, terms that really like get us fired up, right? Which is was kind of the whole ending of Donald Trump's presidency, right? Is that he was too fiery, he got people angry, he got people upset, that's why they stormed the Capitol. He did that with his rhetorical devices, right? So our speech is really important because when you think about the way that you can affect people, the way that you can get people convinced to do what you say to do. I mean, if you look at one of the best speakers in history, it's Hitler. He was like a terrible person, right? But he really was able to convince people to jump on his side. That, and he gave them food when they were starving. So that convinces people pretty easily, right? Yep. So when we look at the proofs, ethos, pathos, logos, those are things that the speaker themselves creates in their speech in order to get other people to listen to them. And I have a video, I don't know, I have a lot of videos in these 4 things, and I just don't know. We'll try to watch a little bit of this one. This chick, she wears me out. She says good things, but...
Schoolyard children are looking at the rhetoric that's behind their argumentation.
So she takes political debates and she breaks them down and shows you the different rhetorical devices that you can use in order to convince people.
That has to do with rhetoric. And these are known as Aristotle's appeals. You've got, first up, logos. That is the appeal to logic. And when you're thinking about appealing to logic, what it really means is not necessarily making sense, but just framing your argument in a way that sounds logical. When you present facts that sound like they could be true or seem reasonable at the time, or when you provide figures and supporting evidence to back up your claim. Now, I want to really emphasize here that one person's logic is not necessarily another person's logic. What is logical to people depends really, really largely on their worldview. So when you're listening to logos arguments, try not to think about whether or not you agree with the person. Just try to think, okay, are they attempting to back up this argument by using things that sound like factual information? That is what you're looking at with logos. Next up, we've got ethos, and ethos is so important in politics. We elect our politicians primarily dependent on their ethos. The most straightforward translation of ethos is that it's the appeal to character. It's giving the audience the sense that the person who's talking to them has the character they desire. But if you look at ethos, it's not just about character. It's also about your reputation, about your accomplishments, about who you are as a person, as an individual, what your personality is like. How trustworthy are you? Really, ethos is our sense of rightness, that the person who is giving us the argument or aspiring to office is the right person to be placed in that position or to be giving that argument and talking to us. Next up, the third one is pathos. Pathos is appeal to emotion. Anytime that someone is trying to make us feel very sympathetic or trying to express their sympathy towards us, they're appealing to pathos. Anytime that someone is trying to get us really riled up and make us feel anxious or nervous or worried or excited about something, they're trying to control and guide our emotions. They are making an argument that's based on appealing to pathos. Now, because I love putting in those little bonus rhetoric devices in there, I will also have a couple of bonus rhetoric devices appearing for your viewing pleasure during this debate, but the primary rhetorical devices and forms of argument that we're going to be going through today are those big three: logos, ethos, and pathos. This one was fun and interesting to put together, so take a gander, and I hope you enjoy it.
I asked a simple question. She's been doing this for 30 years. Why the hell didn't you do it over the last 15, 20 years? You were very much involved, excuse me, my turn. You were very much involved in every aspect of this country, very much. And you do have experience. I'd say the one thing you have over me is experience, but it's bad experience, because what you've done has turned out badly. For 30 years, you've been in a position to help, and if you say that I use steel or I use something else, I make it impossible for me to do that. I wouldn't mind. The problem is you talk, but you don't get anything done, Hillary. You don't. Just like when you ran the State Department, $6 billion was missing. How do you miss $6 billion? You ran the State Department, $6 billion was either stolen, they don't know. It's gone, $6 billion. If you become president, this country is going to be in some mess, believe me.
Well, first of all, what he just said about the State Department is not only untrue, it's been debunked numerous times, but I think it's really an important issue. He raised the 30 years of experience. So let me just talk briefly about that. You know, back in the 1970s, I worked for the Children's Defense Fund, and I was taking on discrimination against African American kids in schools. He was getting sued by the Justice Department for racial discrimination in his apartment buildings. In the 1980s, I was working to reform the schools in Arkansas. He was borrowing $14 million from his father to start his businesses. In the 1990s, I went to Beijing, and I said, women's rights are human rights. He insulted a former Miss Universe, Alicia Machado, called her an eating machine. And on the day when I was in the Situation Room, monitoring the raid that brought Osama bin Laden to justice, he was hosting the Celebrity Apprentice. So I'm happy to compare my 30 years of experience, what I've done for this country, trying to help in every way I could, especially kids and families, get ahead and stay ahead, with your 30 years, and I'll let the American people make that decision.
Well, I think I did a much better job.
Okay, I'm going to stop right there. But that's an example of, as you're speaking in front of people, how you can use ethos, pathos, logos. And you can do that even if you're not debating someone. Like, you can still lay out those arguments, right? But I think that professor, she does a good job of explaining, like, how a logical argument is not necessarily logical to everyone, right? It's all about worldview and how you view it. So those are ways that we can become better speakers. So now we're going to kind of go into the 4 different types of speeches, or 3 different types of speeches. And so the first one is informative. And I talked about this briefly in the last, in chapter 3, so I'm just going to hit on it again. This is not complicated material. An informative speech, obviously, the purpose is to inform, right? You may hear an informative speech called a briefing or a report or even a training, okay? So if you're going into corporate world, these are words that are tossed around, but all they mean are basically informative speeches, okay? A briefing is condensed information, whereas a report is a detailed explanation of what has happened or will happen, and then a training obviously is demonstrating or instructing your audience on how to do something. So as we get ready for our informative speech, which is, by the way, next week, okay? We only have this week. Next week is our informative speech. Think about what kind of informative speech do you want to share with us? Do you want to teach us how to do something? Do you just want to share information about something, about a person, place, event, or thing? And that's what an informative speech is, okay? The next type of speech is a persuasive speech. Obviously, the goal then is to persuade. In a persuasive speech, it's extremely important to pay attention to the different organizational formats that you can use in a persuasive speech, which is actually chapter 5, so I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But a persuasive speech is obviously to change the audience, get them to do something or stop doing something. A team and small group, it's a different kind of speech, but it's going to be either informative or persuasive, right? So it is a type of speech, but it's informative speech or persuasive speech. You're just using a team to do that. So in a team or small group speech, it's got some advantages, it's got some disadvantages. Obviously, advantages, there's an open exchange of information, and you can share the task. You don't have to do all the work, okay? But the disadvantages are that it's more time consuming and it's often difficult to coordinate schedules, and sometimes some of the people that are supposed to do the work don't do the work, and then you end up doing all the work anyway, even though you shouldn't be doing it, because that's not how teams are supposed to work. The key to team presentations, and you're going to want to highlight this because it is an exam question, is transitions, okay? The way to make a team presentation really good is to make sure that the transitions have been practiced and make sense, okay? So that is an exam question. One of the most important parts of team or small group presentations is making sure that the transitions are practiced and that they're very smooth, because transitions can make or break a team panel or speech. There's some different ways that you can do team speeches or small group speeches. You can use a moderator approach, and this is one person allowing the flow of information. So if I had 4 people on my panel, one person might be just the go-between. They might be the transition person, and so they tell us when to move from person to person. You can use a bookend approach, and this is where the person that begins the speech also ends the speech. So like I would say the introduction, and then maybe have you know, first point, second point, third point, and then they'd come back to me to conclude. You can use a panel approach, and this allows for each speaker to have their own set of details that they're sharing, and then you would transition between each person. Panel approaches are often good if you're kind of talking all about the same thing, but you each have your own individual perspective on it. That is a time when you might use the panel approach to a team or small group. Anytime you're in a team or small group presentation, you want to make sure you're attentive to the other members of the group when they're speaking, okay? So the way that we do the team speech in here, we actually do a recorded video, so it's not you doing it live. But if you were to be on a panel live, then your job is to make sure that you're focusing your attention on the person speaking so that everyone else in the audience will focus their attention on the person speaking. And then the last type of speech, which we talked about last time, is a special occasion, celebratory, commemorative. Those all mean the same thing. After dinner speech, speech to entertain, that's all talking about this right here, okay? So there's a lot of different terms for it. But a commemorative or special occasion speech, the purpose of it is to mark an event or an occasion. So it's to make sure that like an event or an occasion has been successfully celebrated, right? So anytime you have someone speak at an event, that is a special occasion speech, okay? So introductions, toasts, acceptance or presentations of awards, eulogies, those are all special occasion speeches, okay, or commemorative speeches, because you're commemorating the event that is occurring. In a special occasion speech, you will still have the organization that I'm teaching you, but it can be a little more lax. You don't necessarily have to have my first point is, my second point is. Your transitions can be a little bit smoother. You don't have to have as much repetition as you do in an informative or persuasive speech. So there are a few differences, but basically anytime you give a speech, if you have an introduction, body, conclusion, then you're right on, okay? We will do an impromptu speech in here. Impromptu speech can be any one of these 3 speeches, right? It could be a special occasion speech, it could be a persuasive speech, it could be an informative speech. Like, you don't really know until the time that it comes to give that speech. Organization should still be present, but like I said, it can be smoother, it can be a little lax when you're looking at a special occasion speech. Any questions on chapter 4?